Captain Riley Jones stared out at the vast emptiness of space, his knuckles white against the cold metal of the console. His eyes, though tired, remained sharp, focused on the series of blinking lights in front of him. Every detail, every signal, counted. The planet he had once called home, Earth, was a dying husk, a crumbling testament to the hubris of mankind. It was up to him and his team to ensure humanity's survival. 20 seconds until the final launch, the voice of the mission control technician crackled through his earpiece, sharp and steady. "All systems go." Riley nodded to himself, though no one could see. This was it, the culmination of decades of planning, research, and hope. In a few moments, they would launch, aiming for the unreachable, Venus. What awaited them there, no one truly knew, but there was no other option. Earth was collapsing. There were no more resources. No more time. He glanced over at Dr. Olivia Martins, who was seated beside him, her fingers flying over the control panel, adjusting algorithms, checking data. Her calm demeanor betrayed nothing of the storm she must have been feeling inside. Riley respected her dedication, but he could see it in her eyes. She was beginning to question whether Venus was the answer or just another desperate gamble. "How are we looking, Olivia?" Riley asked, his voice steady despite the churning in his gut. Olivia didn't look up. "Systems are nominal," she replied, her voice flat, measured. "But I can't shake the feeling that we're rushing into something we don't fully understand." "I know," Riley muttered, his gaze returning to the dark void outside. "But we're out of options. The Earth is done. This is humanity's last shot. Venus is our future." Olivia didn't respond, though her fingers hesitated for a moment over the keys. She knew the stakes, but the scientist in her couldn't help but wonder if the unknowns of Venus might turn out to be more dangerous than the dying Earth. 10 seconds, the technician called again, this time with more urgency. Riley's eyes flicked back to the countdown clock. The seconds seemed to stretch into infinity. His mind flashed through memories, his family, his friends, all the people left behind, stuck on a planet with no future. He wasn't just piloting a ship. He was carrying the weight of humanity's legacy. "Prepare for launch," he said, his voice firm. His hands moved instinctively, flipping switches and pressing buttons, ensuring the spacecraft's trajectory was set. The roar of the engines igniting reverberated through the vessel, a reminder that they were now on a path from which there was no return. The vessel began to shudder as it slowly ascended, breaking free from Earth's atmosphere. Riley's stomach lurched. It felt like he was leaving everything behind, his past, his history, all of it, to embark on a journey into the unknown. In the back of the cabin, Commander Alex Hayes sat in silence. Unlike the others, Hayes was quiet, a rock in the storm. His dark eyes never wavered from the console in front of him, but Riley knew there was more to him than the stoic exterior. Hayes had seen things. Things he never talked about. Now, his role was clear, to ensure the mission's success, no matter the cost. The team had been handpicked for their skills and their resolve, but Riley knew that in the face of something as monumental as this, they were all just one step away from failure. As the ship pushed through the outer layers of the atmosphere, a tremor ran through the vessel. The sound of the engines faltered for a brief moment, then returned with a thundering roar. "Riley," Olivia's voice came over the intercom, tight with tension, "we've got a problem with the navigation system. It's malfunctioning." "What kind of malfunction?" Riley asked, heart racing. "The system's not updating. We're off course by a fraction of a degree. If we don't correct it, we'll miss our Venusian entry point." Riley's fingers flew over the control panel, his mind racing. "How long do we have?" 30 minutes before we're completely off track." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, a wave of unease settling over them. Every second counted. If they missed their entry point, the entire mission could end before they even made it to Venus. Riley's jaw tightened. "Olivia, I need you to override the system. Get us back on course." "I'm on it," Olivia said, her voice tense but determined. She began to input commands, her face reflecting the battle taking place between her analytical mind and the growing concern gnawing at her. Commander Hayes turned in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Are we going to make it?" he asked. "We'll make it," Riley said, though he wasn't so sure. His eyes flicked over the readouts, his mind calculating the odds. Every decision he made now had irreversible consequences. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Riley watched Olivia work, her brow furrowed in concentration. Hayes remained silent, but Riley could feel the weight of his gaze, waiting for the inevitable. Finally, Olivia let out a sigh of relief. "We're back on track," she said, her voice strained but victorious. Riley's shoulders relaxed, but only slightly. They weren't out of danger yet, and he knew it. The real challenge lay ahead. The unknowns of Venus were beyond anything they had prepared for. They had trained for years, simulated every possible scenario, but nothing could have truly prepared them for what awaited on the surface of that hellish planet. "Good work," Riley said. "But don't get comfortable. This is just the beginning." As the ship glided into the vast emptiness of space, the stars glittered ahead, a silent witness to their struggle. Earth was gone. The future was in their hands now. All they had to do was survive the journey, and the planet they were about to call home. Olivia took a deep breath, her fingers still hovering above the console. Hayes looked ahead, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the endless black. They were all thinking the same thing. Venus was a gamble, and they had no idea if they would win. But they were going anyway. The sound of the ship's engines rumbled like distant thunder, vibrating the hull as the crew hurtled through the vast emptiness of space. The stars flickered outside, indifferent to the fragile vessel carrying humanity's last hope. Captain Riley Jones gripped the armrest of his seat, his eyes scanning the fluctuating data on the console. They were nearing Venus. Every movement, every adjustment now felt like a countdown, a ticking clock to an uncertain fate. Approaching Venus in 30 minutes, the soft voice of the ship's AI chimed, its cool, neutral tone a stark contrast to the urgency building within Riley's chest. He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, his mind running through the checklist for entry. They had made it this far, but that was nothing. The real test would be what awaited them on the surface. The hostile, poisonous atmosphere of Venus had thwarted every attempt at colonization before. No one truly knew what lay beneath the clouds. They were pioneers, explorers in a world that might never be theirs to claim. He turned to his left, where Dr. Olivia Martins was seated, her fingers dancing over the controls. Her brow was furrowed, eyes intent on the data streaming across the screen. The dim light of the cabin glinted off her glasses, but there was no mistaking the tension in her body. Olivia had been the one to spearhead much of the planning for this mission. She believed in the science, in the numbers. But even she couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in her gut. "How are we looking?" Riley asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Her response came with a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "As expected. The atmospheric pressure on Venus is already messing with our sensors. If the storm clouds are as dense as projected, we'll have limited visibility once we descend." Riley nodded, the weight of the mission pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Any backup systems?" "We'll have manual control for descent, but we'll be flying blind for a while." "It's either that, or we risk the ship tearing apart in the upper atmosphere," Olivia explained. "The magnetic field's interference is making things worse." From the corner of the room, Commander Alex Hayes, who had been silently observing the unfolding tension, spoke up. "We don't have a choice. We descend, or we'll be trapped in orbit with no way back. This isn't a test anymore, it's a race against time." His voice was calm, but Riley could sense the undercurrent of anxiety beneath the stoic exterior. Hayes was the anchor of the crew, the one who held things together when the rest of them began to crack. But even Hayes had his breaking point. "Right," Riley said, taking a deep breath. "We prepare for manual descent. Olivia, stay sharp. Hayes, get ready to take the helm if anything goes wrong. We're about to make history. Let's not screw this up." The ship shook violently as the descent began. Outside the portholes, the swirling orange clouds of Venus loomed like an ominous curtain. The air inside the ship felt thick with tension. Every light on the dashboard flickered momentarily before stabilizing. Riley's heart pounded as they broke through the outer layers of the atmosphere. "It's getting worse," Olivia muttered, her fingers flying over the console. "We're losing stability. The turbulence is higher than anticipated." The ship's frame groaned in protest, the hull vibrating as if it were protesting its own existence. Riley's grip tightened on the controls, his focus narrowing. This was no longer about exploration. This was survival. "Hayes, prepare for the worst," he said. "Olivia, I need your eyes on the data, every second counts." "On it," she replied, her voice steady but taut. The storm outside was now visible through the viewports, thick clouds swirling with violent energy. Lightning crackled in the distance, followed by the sharp thud of thunder, a deep, resonating boom that rattled the ship to its core. Approaching the storm front, the AI's voice announced, its calmness a sharp contrast to the chaos outside. "Velocity at critical levels. Recommend immediate stabilization." Riley clenched his teeth. They couldn't afford to slow down. Too much was at stake. "Get us through this, Olivia," he commanded. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "Engaging manual override. Initiating stabilization sequence now." With each passing second, the turbulence grew more intense. The lights flickered again, throwing the cabin into brief shadows before returning to their dim glow. Riley's knuckles were white against the steering controls. The storm outside was violent and unpredictable, much like the planet itself. Then, without warning, a violent jolt sent the crew forward. Riley's hands flew to the controls, desperately trying to correct their descent. Alarms blared throughout the ship, signaling a breach in the ship's outer shell. "We've been hit," Hayes shouted, rushing toward the rear of the cabin. "The hull's compromised. We're losing air pressure. Olivia, can you seal the breach?" Riley barked, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm trying." Olivia snapped back, but her fingers hesitated, frozen on the console for a moment. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead. The storm outside was relentless, the winds battering the ship with an unforgiving force. "Get it together, Olivia." Riley's voice was sharper now, desperate. "I know," she muttered, as her hands moved rapidly, inputting command after command. "I've got it." The ship lurched again, but this time, Olivia's quick thinking stabilized them. The breach was sealed, and the alarms finally fell silent. But the tension remained thick in the air. Riley exhaled sharply, his gaze moving from Olivia to Hayes. He couldn't let this be their undoing. "We can still make it. We have to land." For a brief moment, the crew sat in silence, the harsh reality of their situation settling in. They had survived this far, but the hardest part was just beginning. Venus was still an unknown, an unforgiving world waiting to swallow them whole. "Brace yourselves," Riley said, his voice steely with determination. "We're not just landing, we're starting over. Whatever happens, we do it together." The ship shuddered once more as they fought their way deeper into the storm. The lightning flashed outside, illuminating the swirling maelstrom of clouds. The planet had no mercy, but neither did they. They were humanity's last chance, and they would not be defeated. As they descended further into the heart of Venus, Riley's final thought echoed in his mind, "This is just the beginning." The descent had been harrowing. The storm clouds raged as they cut through the thick atmosphere of Venus. Captain Riley Jones, gripping the edge of his seat, watched the readouts flicker violently. Each warning light felt like a drumbeat of impending doom. They were getting close to landing, but there was no certainty in the air, only the oppressive weight of their journey and the unknowns that awaited them below. 5 minutes until touchdown, the calm voice of the ship's AI echoed through the cabin, an almost cruel contrast to the chaos outside. Riley's eyes shifted to Dr. Olivia Martins, seated beside him. Her face was drawn, the usual spark in her eyes now replaced by a sharp focus. She was the scientist, the one who had spent years studying the data, preparing for this moment, yet even she couldn't mask the unease creeping into her posture. "Everything look good?" Riley asked, though he already knew the answer. The data was constantly fluctuating. Olivia didn't look up, her fingers moving across the controls with expert precision. "It's not good, it's not bad. We're going to land, but I can't guarantee anything beyond that. Venus is unpredictable." Riley let out a slow breath, his mind running through the calculations. They had to succeed. There were no backups. There was no return. If they failed now, humanity's future would be lost before it even began. Commander Alex Hayes, who had been silently watching the interaction from behind them, finally spoke. "What's our plan once we hit the surface?" "We have no idea what we're landing into." Riley gave him a quick glance. Hayes was right to ask. The surface of Venus was shrouded in mystery. All they had to go on were ancient, incomplete data from previous, failed missions and scientific models that didn't tell the whole story. Their survival would depend on how well they could adapt once they were down. "We land first, then we assess," Riley said. "We've got to set up the base camp, make sure we're alive before we can even think about exploring." Hayes nodded, but Riley could see the unease in his eyes. Hayes was a man of action, not theory. Yet he was the steady hand they needed in a crisis, even if he preferred a different type of challenge. The ship rattled again, sending a fresh wave of tension through the crew. The cabin lights flickered and dimmed, then brightened again, the sudden changes in the power supply adding to the sense of disarray. Riley's stomach twisted as they neared the surface. He knew they had to trust their training, but part of him couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that they were on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could send them tumbling into the unknown. "We've reached the atmospheric boundary," Olivia reported, her voice taut with concentration. "Initiating final descent protocol." Riley's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. "Take us in slowly," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "We don't want to burn through the atmosphere too fast." There was a pause, then Olivia's fingers moved swiftly across the console, inputting new commands. The ship's descent slowed as they passed through the thick cloud cover, and the first view of the surface appeared, swathes of volcanic terrain and vast stretches of barren land. The landscape was stark, ominous, and alien. For a brief moment, Riley could almost imagine it was a desert world, devoid of life. But there was no time to contemplate. The ship's controls flared with sudden warnings. "Warning, landing gear failure," the AI chimed, its neutral tone belying the severity of the situation. "What's that mean?" Hayes snapped, turning toward Olivia. "It means the landing struts are malfunctioning," Olivia replied. "We won't be able to land smoothly. The impact will be hard." Riley cursed under his breath. They had no choice. They couldn't abort the landing, not with Venus waiting just beneath them. "Engage manual override," he ordered. "Prepare for an emergency landing." The ship groaned as the controls responded sluggishly. The ground was coming up too fast, too hard. They were on a collision course with the surface, and there was no way to soften it. Riley's eyes snapped to Olivia, who was frantically working the controls. Her brow furrowed, a vein of desperation creeping into her calm demeanor. The lights flickered again as the ship pitched forward, the rumble of the engines a deafening roar. Riley could feel the sharp pull of gravity as they plummeted downward. "We're not going to make it!" Olivia shouted, her hands shaking now as she tried to stabilize their descent. "Hold on!" Riley shouted, gripping the controls with white knuckles. With a final, bone-jarring jolt, the ship hit the ground. The impact was thunderous, a shockwave reverberating through the entire vessel. For a long moment, everything was chaos, shattered metal, groaning machinery, and the screams of emergency alarms. Riley's world spun as he was thrown against his harness, his breath stolen by the force of the crash. Then, it stopped. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hiss of pressure valves and the low hum of damaged systems. Riley's pulse thudded in his ears as he forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. The world was spinning, but they were alive. Status, he croaked, his voice rough. Olivia was the first to respond, her hands still on the controls, eyes wide with shock. "We've landed," she said, disbelief in her tone. "But we're not in one piece. Hull's compromised. Systems are down." Hayes unstrapped himself and turned to face Riley. "We need to get out of here. Now." Riley nodded, forcing himself to stand despite the vertigo that still gripped him. "Agreed. Let's get the airlocks open." The crew stumbled from their seats, shaken but alive. As Riley reached the hatch, the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow across the cabin. He punched the release button, and the door slowly hissed open, revealing the harsh, alien landscape of Venus. The air was thick and oppressive, the atmosphere stifling and toxic. Riley's heart raced, but he stepped forward, knowing that their survival depended on what they did next. "What now?" Olivia asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of their suits hissing as they sealed tight. "We begin," Riley said, his voice low, but resolute. "We survive, we explore, and we take this planet back for humanity." The first step onto Venus was a monumental one, not just for them, but for all of humanity. And as Riley set foot on the barren world, he felt a fierce spark of determination. They had survived the impossible, and now they would face whatever lay ahead, together. Riley's boots sunk into the strange, rocky terrain of Venus, the first human foot to touch its hostile surface in recorded history. The planet's sky was a roiling sea of orange and yellow, thick with clouds of sulfuric acid that blotted out the sun, casting a sickly glow over the alien landscape. Heat radiated from the ground, oppressive and unrelenting, the air toxic and nearly impossible to breathe without the protection of their suits. The ship had crashed, but they had survived. That in itself was a victory. Now, the real challenge began. Riley took a long, steadying breath, the artificial oxygen from his suit filling his lungs, a cold contrast to the hellish air outside. He turned, his eyes sweeping across the crew. Dr. Olivia Martins was already checking the survival equipment, her movements sharp and efficient, despite the gravity of their situation. Hayes, ever the quiet presence, was studying the horizon, his gaze distant, as if he could already see their future unfolding. "We need to set up the base camp," Riley said, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of exhaustion. They had no time to waste. Venus had already proven itself to be unforgiving, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it would become. "Agreed," Olivia replied, her tone clipped. "We can't afford to waste any more time. We've got enough supplies to last a few weeks, but after that, we're on our own." Riley nodded. Their goal was simple: survive, and then explore. Venus was their home now, whether they liked it or not. But first, they needed shelter, a place to regroup and assess their situation. The ship's systems were fried beyond repair. Their only hope lay in the portable shelter module they had brought along, a small but vital piece of equipment that could keep them alive long enough to figure out their next steps. Hayes unstrapped a heavy bag from his shoulder and handed it to Olivia. "I'll scout the area," he said, his voice steady, betraying no emotion. "I'll make sure there's no immediate threat before we set up camp." Riley glanced at him, seeing the undercurrent of tension in Hayes' movements. He was used to the silence, to the calm, but Riley knew better than to trust it. Hayes was hiding something. There was always more beneath the surface with him, things he didn't say, things he kept locked away. But now was not the time to press him. They needed him focused. "Be careful," Riley warned, watching Hayes head toward the rocky outcropping in the distance. "We don't know what's out there." Olivia's eyes followed Hayes for a moment before she turned back to the task at hand. "We need to make this quick," she said, her fingers moving over the shelter's activation panel. "We have one shot at this. If we don't get the shelter up before nightfall, we could end up exposed to the elements. The storm's coming, and it won't be forgiving." Riley nodded, his mind already racing ahead. Time was slipping away, and Venus was not kind to those who dawdled. The winds were picking up, swirling the hot, stifling air in strange, unpredictable gusts. Soon, the temperature would rise to dangerous levels, and the acidic rains would begin to fall. They needed to be inside, sheltered, before the worst hit. Olivia's fingers worked the panel with practiced speed. A soft beep sounded, followed by a low hum as the shelter began to unfold from its compact form. A sturdy frame shot out of the ground, rapidly expanding into a dome-shaped structure. In minutes, it was fully erected, its reinforced exterior glinting faintly in the toxic light. "We're in business," Olivia said, stepping back to admire her work. There was a small sense of relief on her face, but Riley knew it was only temporary. This was just the first hurdle. As he turned to help Olivia with the interior, his communicator buzzed with a message from Hayes. Riley's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. "Riley, you need to see this," Hayes' voice crackled through the static. Riley's pulse quickened. "What is it?" There was a long pause before Hayes responded, the tension in his voice palpable. "I found something. Not what I expected. It's a structure. Ancient. And it's not human." Riley's heart skipped a beat. "A structure? What do you mean?" "I'm sending you the coordinates," Hayes said. "Just get here. You need to see it for yourself." Riley's mind raced as he exchanged a glance with Olivia. "Stay here. Lock down the shelter. I'll go with Hayes." Olivia nodded, her expression unreadable. "Be careful. If this is another failed mission like the others, we need to be ready to adapt." Riley didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his gear and hurried out of the shelter, the heavy boots of his suit thudding against the uneven ground. The air outside was stifling, the pressure of Venus pushing against him like a physical weight. The journey to Hayes' location was slow, the terrain treacherous, but Riley pressed on. He had to see this for himself. It didn't take long before he spotted Hayes, standing at the edge of a jagged cliff, peering down at something beyond the horizon. The faint outline of a large, angular structure emerged from the mist, its silhouette almost unnatural against the chaotic landscape. Riley approached cautiously, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts as he drew closer to Hayes. "This is it," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. The structure loomed ahead, massive, imposing, and clearly not made by human hands. It was unlike anything Riley had ever seen, its design both elegant and terrifying, with sharp angles and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand. "What is this?" Riley murmured, his mind racing with possibilities. The implications were staggering. Venus had never been considered a world capable of supporting intelligent life, at least, not by any scientific standard. Yet here they were, staring at a structure that suggested otherwise. "We need to investigate," Hayes said, his voice low but urgent. "If this is what I think it is, it could change everything." Riley turned to him, his heart thudding in his chest. This could be the key to everything. If there's technology here, if this is a sign of an advanced civilization. Hayes nodded, his gaze fixed on the structure. "We need to be careful. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Or it could be our undoing." Riley stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his communicator. "We need to bring Olivia in. We need to understand this, all of it." As they moved closer to the structure, the ground beneath them seemed to hum with a strange, almost imperceptible vibration. The air crackled with energy, and Riley couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something was out there, something far older than anything they could imagine. And it was waiting for them. The unknown stretched before them, a vast, uncharted mystery that could either lead to salvation or destruction. The real journey had just begun.